Thanks for having me. A pleasure and an honor. Genes and us. And Amir ended with social theory, and it's no coincidence that it's me now following up on, not on the history, but on the philosophy of science that connects to some of the issues he talked about. So you get a bit of social theory and a bit of philosophy. You have a handout, and you can follow through here as well. I tried to move it, hopefully not destroying anything. So in public imagination, I think Mendel stands for our hopes and anxieties. Mendel is most known not for the details of his laws and ratios, at least not directly. His name, I think, is the name for genetic knowledge that is practically relevant for plans and hopes, not only, but in particular with respect to family planning. The name Mendel stands for genetic factors that could ruin our plans and hopes. Mendel is about genes and us. That's what I mean with the title. Hence, it is also no surprise that there is a company that calls itself Genes and Us, advertising themselves as follows. It's not on the slides. I quote, "Genes and Us helps families understand how their genetics affect their health. Couples can connect their 23andMe accounts to understand what traits they will pass on to their children, the good genes and the bad genes, the traits they will definitely pass on, and the traits they may or may not pass on." Quoted from Crunchbase.com, which has this company called Genes and Us. But not just companies, but also medical personnel might say such things about your genes or our genes and us. And it has also become a widespread social practice that people talk about these things, whether the genes are important for your identity, whether they're good or bad, and whether one passes them on. And such questions are part of anxieties, and Amir uses the term Mendelian anxieties for what happened some time ago. And I will neither analyze the business practices nor related medical or social practices and anxieties themselves. What I want to do is to focus on the epistemological side of such practices. And in generic form, I call these practices, second line on the handout, genetic foregrounding. And I will ask, what is it, that genetic foregrounding, and how does it happen? And I will ask that from a philosophical and social theory perspective. So foregrounding is part of causal analysis. Causal analysis happens when people predict or explain traits of people or their behavior. And if the causal analysis goes to the future, it's a prediction, and if the causal analysis goes to the past, it's an explanation. That kind of symmetry I'm assuming here. I'm also assuming that ontologically viewed, so ontologically means what there is in the world, each event in the world has more than one cause. Sometimes that's called multifactoriality, sometimes causal plurality, doesn't matter much how we call it. I'm interested more in the difference between the ontological perspective and the epistemological perspective. So epistemologically viewed, we nonetheless select usually among the causes that exist. That means if causal factors are foregrounded, they are positively selected for our attention epistemologically. They are in focus, they are made visible. If they are backgrounded, negatively selected, they are ignored or left unanalyzed. They are neglected, so to say. And that this is so far that is actually consensus in the philosophy of causation and also in the philosophy of science, which is my expertise, and details you can see in more published work. The controversial issue is not that there is causal plurality or that there is causal selection, the 2 bullet points, so to say, on the handout, the second bullet point, but how and why causal selection happens and what guides us in the specific practice of genetic foregrounding, so selecting the genes for making them visible. And the core claim about what happens if we do genetic foreground is the following. Foregrounding genetic factors, I read from that passage in the handout, foregrounding genetic factors happens at the interface of science and society and is thus a matter that is scientific and social at the same time. Whether genetic resources matter for us, for our future, is not decided by the facts, the causal facts, uncovered by the scientists alone. Now, the argument for this claim is that I'm trying to show you that in our causal analysis, forward and backwards, predicting and explaining, we tend to select those causes we are willing to intervene on. And that willing to intervene on is really the core, the philosophical core of what I want to do today here. And what we are willing to intervene on depends on values and interests, which often depend on our social positionality, so on the standpoint we have in a certain setting. And that standpoint determines, or from which we set a focus and foreground and background causal factors. Now that means certainly, and I think this is important for a public setting that we have here, bringing science and society together. One cannot offload responsibility for the foregrounding of genetic resources to the sciences. It is our responsibility in the respective society to think about how we relate to our genetic factors. It's our responsibility whether we put genetic resources to the foreground or not. Now you get part 1 and part 2, more on causal selection, and then part 2, I fill in the details on what I'm claiming here, because you will not yet believe me, I guess. So part 1, causal selection and the willingness to control. Philosophers like to use what I like to call toy cases, so simple cases where you can show something more complex. And here it is. Here's the toy case. Imagine a fire in the barn. I hope there's a barn somewhere next to the Konrad Lorenz Institute. Imagine a fire in the barn next to the Konrad Lorenz Institute. And now I'm going to try to show you why we foreground the actions of the children. So there's a fire in the barn, and those who called the fire service saw kids running out of the building just when the fire started. The fire service inspecting the place, reducing the fire, saw matches flying around. So everyone says, who caused the fire? What caused the fire? And people would say, the children, right? That's what you would say. Now I need a dummy chemist in the room who says, hey, wait a minute. Well, actually, oxygen causes the fire, right? Not the children. Actually, look at the sciences and the facts about causation. And then the philosopher comes along and says, yeah, you know, both of you are right. The children cause the fire and the oxygen cause the fire because you need a burnable substance, you need something that can start the fire, and you need oxygen. So in the language of necessary and sufficient conditions that has been fashionable in philosophy, all of these 3 things are necessary factors for there to be a fire on that spot during that time, etc. In a more contemporary language, all of these things are difference makers. They make a difference to whether something occurs the way it does occur. So both explanations, quoting the kids and quoting the oxygen, are correct. Call them true if you wish, because both have an equal right to be included in causal explanation. Both have an equal right to be foregrounded. So why are we foregrounding the kids? Why are we foregrounding the children playing with the matches in the barn in our explanation for the fire? Now, we normally want to prevent fires, and we want to discipline the kids. We want to educate them, and by educating them, we intervene on their having things the way they have them. We want to educate them to not play with the matches in situations where fires are to be prevented, meaning we're willing to intervene on the children. But it's pointless to intervene on the oxygen, right? Oxygen is not just normally there. There's also, in the context of a barn in a normal environment, no reason to aim at preventing oxygen to prevent fires. Now, for those who know a little bit about the history of these discussions, the context dependency is really very important, but for details. So for us today, what I want to show with this simple toy case is that what is peculiar about oxygen is not only that it is normally around and the kids are kind of a more actual difference makers and the other one is more stably there. It's also the case that we want to make sure that the oxygen is there, that it stays normal, and control for it, for the world, so that it stays normal, right? So that environmental factor is meant to stay as it is. So we control for it in that sense. The kids carelessly playing with matches is something that we want to prevent and control for it in that forward sense. We intervene on it so that the kids' behavior changes and they never play with matches again. That's why we foreground the kids as a cause. So now, as a result from that toy case, we put to the foreground those things that we want to control in a forward sense, that is, change in a controlled manner, for instance, the children's behavior. To the background, we put factors we do not care to change or even want to stay as they are, for instance, the presence of oxygen. These are factors which we do not care for or for which we want to control in a conservative sense so that they stay normal as they are. Good, that's part one. Part two, real cases. Diseases and other kinds of suffering and why we foreground genetic factors. A note on part one, and I put here a reference. I haven't mentioned that I'm certainly building on other major accounts of philosophical accounts of causal selection, and I combine them. So I combine something that comes from Collingwood and Hart and Honoré and try to show that Ken Waters is wrong with his account, just for the background. Now, real cases, part two. The relevant question is, which societies, or if it's about individuals, who will have a higher willingness to intervene on genetic resources, rather than on other developmental resources, usually summarized under environmental factors. And Eva, I think, will nicely show us the complexity that that distinction is already kind of wrong, but I have to assume it for the sake of just looking at foregrounding of genetic factors, which happened in the past and still happens today. And turn around the handout. So I want to start with the contemporary society, the society for the West, let's say Europe, North America, those developing countries that develop toward the ways of living in the West. We are living in a social setting where we do the genetic foregrounding. Most of us do it very often, or some of us suffices. It's a pattern, it's a practice in our society. But we could focus our search on whether specific environments are necessary conditions or difference makers for specific diseases. But we don't, so why? And Philip Kitcher has nicely captured in the quote I'm going to read, my willingness to control answer to that question. Who is doing it? Who has a higher willingness? So I read. Those of us, on the second page of the handout, those of us who live comfortably worry less that our sons and daughters will suffer from neglect or abuse. We, after all, intend to provide them with safe and nurturing environments. But we are not immune to disaster. The genes may strike. And if they do, all our effort will be in vain. Accordingly, we are very interested in one kind of cause of the diminution in quality of people's lives. Other kinds of causes, environmental factors that wreak havoc with lives, are not perceived as our problem. So in my words, of the willingness to control account, that means that many of us do not mind that the social inequalities of our contemporary society, causing diseases and other kinds of suffering, stay as they are. We background these social inequalities in our explanation of suffering, either since we don't care about them or since we actually want them to stay as they are, want them to stay normal, since we profit from these actively or passively. But we do mind and want to get control over the things we don't yet have control over, genetic resources of our bodies. So recall and I put the comparison in these 2 bullet points here. Recall now this toy case with the fire. Metaphorically speaking, the social inequalities are the oxygen of our society, social inequalities. Those dominating these societies are not willing to intervene on that oxygen, on these social inequalities on which they thrive. Now, the kids playing with the fire equal metaphorically the genetic resources that even those well-off won't be able to control, at least less easily than they have managed to control their environment. Hence, the anxiety kicks in. The genetic resources are powers we are afraid of, powers, factors we cannot yet control, and thus aim to bring under control, given our social positionality. Meaning we can't just blame the scientists for being too focused on genes. It comes from our anxieties. So Amir didn't mention the term Mendelian anxiety that he's using in the talk. He didn't mention that this is something that he diagnoses of the time. That anxiety that comes from the genes being hidden, and because they're hidden, they're less under control. Or the kind of discussions that we had following there. And my claim is now that this Mendelian anxiety of that time is actually a variant of a more general anxiety, one that dominates even our contemporary society, namely that the genetic resources may strike. And this then certainly is a variant of a still more general anxiety from that prioritizing foregrounders, bacteria, viruses, the disease agents, which are then usually perceived to be in bodies. And then we also in your talk, we had that general worry about them hiding in us. Now I want to add a little bit of history. I still have time, right? Yes. Good. Because in addition to the willingness to control genetic resources, we nowadays also have an increased ability to control, which at Mendelian times we didn't have. According to Lisa Gannett, the foregrounding of genetic resources in explanatory and predictive analysis is to a higher technological and epistemic tractability compared to environmental factors, so higher technological and epistemic tractability. So this is not contradicting my account, it's more like of zooming in. So among the causes we are willing to intervene on, we look for those that we can actually handle, that we can actually already control. So 2 reasons why we would focus on the genetic resources, 2 reasons that we have today. And we do believe, many of us do believe that we can handle genetic resources at least more easily than we are able to handle environmental resources, in the sense that we can experiment on them, map them, screen them, and select these genetic resources with the help of modern technology. And we believe this even though the promises of gene therapy and pharmacogenetics are still promises or specters, depending on what you look at exactly. But I want to add to this tractability claim from Gannett 1 point. So it is true that if we try to screen your personal environment, the way someone could screen your DNA, well, you see that it's actually very hard. We don't know which environmental factor to focus on, and actually the environment is unbelievably complex. So everything that we put under the label environment or nurture traditionally is so amazingly complex that it's not just epistemically and technologically that the environment is hard to track. It's just very complex. So our admiration of, oh my God, how complex is all the business in genetics should also actually go to environmental factors, because it is quite complex. Now, if we factor these 2, so we have 2 things. We have the increased ability to control, And now the question I want to stop with is what applies to the society people at Mendel's time? Because the morning was history, so I want to now look back to history. It's clear, I think, from given the expertise in this room, I don't need to explain that long, that the ability to control genetic factors at Mendel's times, in the sense of tractability, was much lower. So that was not the factor that explained why genetic factors were foregrounding at that time. But the willingness to control, the first part of the story, already pointed at foregrounding genetic factors for those who had to be less afraid of environmental factors. Already 100 years ago, the society was characterized by a lot of social inequalities, and Barbara showed us some of these, right? And those in a position of power already had not a willingness to change the social inequalities that wreaked havoc with other people's lives. But the genetic factors were a problem for them as well. So that willingness to control also applies to society and people at Mendel's time. And whether there are other factors like the kind of racism or purist ontology that Amir was highlighting, and certain interaction with science and society, I can't answer, but it gives me the opportunity to add a disclaimer. The willingness to control is one factor in a social explanation of why we foreground genetic factors, right? It's not, I'm trying to show you that it is an important principle that explains why we as humans foreground genetic factors independent of the facts, right? Because the facts are there, but we select from the facts. And there are other factors as well, and ideas of purity are to mention here. I was thinking about the concept of passing, which is nowadays a big topic with respect to gender and race, whether a person passes as American rather than Hispanic, whether a person passes as a woman rather than as something else. So these dichotomies of observation and some hidden kind of constituents are also part of our own reasoning. There's one question I still have to address. Why did rather disadvantaged people buy into the Mendelian anxiety back in time when it was the willingness to control of those high up in a society that I claim was an important factor why genetic foregrounding happened? And I think even at that time, even without social media, the discourse at the time, I'd say, but historians are welcome to show me otherwise, the discourse about genetic resources was predominantly driven by those high up in the social hierarchy. So we don't see the voices of those who had really hard times. So that's what I can contribute. I could say something on why that matters for actual social reality, not just the discourse and our epistemic stances on it. For instance, with respect to Down syndrome, but I leave it at that so that we have time for discussion.
Yeah, we still have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes for Down syndrome, that's not enough. Let me then just say the one thing. So if we background the environmental factors and foreground the genetic factors epistemically, right? So there are the facts and we select among the causes, which are facts, that they are causally relevant. Then when we do that, and then it's the willingness to control, then we are willingness to intervene, then that willingness to intervene leads to interventions, right? If the ability to intervene is there as well. And that then changes the actual ontological reality. So you have a different distribution of actual causal factors there. In the kids' case, the kids don't play with matches anymore, so there won't be any fires anymore, but the oxygen will still be there. And the same kind of looping effect of what you select among the causes to what there is as causes ontologically in the future happens in our social reality as well. And we know that mechanism from selection against people with Down syndrome. even though we also know, and that happens in social reality, even though we also know that since the last 100 years, life expectancy of people with Down syndrome went from, I think, I have it somewhere, the data, I can show you the publication, from 9 years to 80 years in the West. Hispanics, black people don't have such a high life expectancy because we're not willing to intervene in the social inequalities that wreak havoc with other people's lives. So with all these diseases that are called genetic, we have a duty as a society and as a scientist also to tell the other part of the story, and how the two stories interact, I think, will be addressed in the next talk. So that's why I think these abstract philosophical reflections are, I think, are important. And thanks to Ron of Lynn, who pointed out the fact of that life expectancy going up so much. Didn't know that. And thanks for listening, and thanks for having me.